I have to admit I get a little bit amused at commentators and politicians who seem to think that the federal system, as figured out by the drafters of the Constitution, was the last word. As I pointed out in the last lecture, this was a work in progress, and it still is. And in the process of having our federal system develop, a number of theories have emerged to explain federalism. The first was dual federalism. Each level operates within its own exclusive area of jurisdiction. Well, that particular theory lasted until about George Washington's administration and began to be seriously challenged in the early 1800s. But it wasn't until the mid-1900s that a whole new theory of federalism evolved. And in the late 20th century, under the Reagan administration, there developed the third theory, regulatory federalism. So we'll take a look at each of those and see how they played out. Now, in the very early years, two rulings in the early 1800s had a major impact on the balance of power between the national government and the state governments. The first was the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. Did the national government have the right to establish a bank? Now, I would love if we had the time to go into great detail on McCulloch versus Maryland. There is an excellent Wikipedia article on it. The book has a fairly decent discussion. If you Google it, you'll be able to spend untold hours looking at the case. But bottom line is, it said that the national government had the right to establish a bank because it had implied powers. This is the so-called implied powers. The second case had to do with licensing and regulating the use of steamboats on the Hudson River. This was the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, and it upheld broad congressional power to regulate interstate commerce, that is, commerce between the states. In this instance, interstate commerce involved commerce on the Hudson River entirely within the state of New York. New York claimed that since the Hudson River was totally within the state of New York, it and it alone could regulate commerce on the Hudson River. But the commerce going as far as Albany came from other states, and the Supreme Court upheld the right of Congress to license and regulate trade on the Hudson River because it was in interstate commerce. Now, the dual federalism concept was that the national government and the state governments have completely separate and distinct powers, and that the national government should not exceed its constitutionally enumerated powers, and that all other powers are and should be reserved to the states. The intellectual background or legal background for the dual federalism is the 10th Amendment, which we've already looked at. Probably one of the worst cases that the Supreme Court has ever decided was the Dred Scott versus Stanford case in 1857. It did several things. It declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, and the Missouri Compromise, if you want to read about it, limited slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line and in the new Ohio and western colonies, and said that Congress had the authority, lacked the authority, to ban slavery in territories. But it went beyond that. If you want to read on the Dred Scott decision, it also declared that Dred Scott had no rights to even sue because African Americans were not within the scope of the Constitution considered to be people. That probably helped trigger a little bit of the Civil War. Now, the national government grew in both size and powers after the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were directly designed to overturn Dred Scott decision. But the Supreme Court adhered to the concept of dual federalism when it came to the rights of African Americans. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 said it was all right for the southern states to require segregation so long as there were equal facilities. there was some confusion over the role of the states and the national government in the regulation of commerce, and all sorts of inconsistent rulings about the scope of national power. Well, the 16th Amendment authorized Congress to enact a national income tax. Interestingly enough, the income tax had been adopted during the Civil War, and the Supreme Court in 1911, or the Supreme Court in the early 1900s, declared that the national government did not have the authority. So the 16th Amendment overturned that particular provision. The 17th Amendment in 1913 made senators directly elected by the people and removed their selection from the state legislatures. Now, I thought that was a dead issue until recently, when various senators and various governors began to governors began to argue in favor of repealing the 17th Amendment and returning the selection of senators to state legislatures. Even Governor Perry, governor of Texas, flirted with the idea briefly. The New Deal was a major watershed in the powers of the national government and the state governments. The Great Depression showed that the states simply could not deal with overwhelming economic problems, bank failures, slump in agricultural prices, the construction industry went into decline, and then the final coup de grace, when on October 29th, 1929, the stock market totally crashed. And that it didn't lead to the Depression, but it set off a major beginning of the Depression. The election of 1932 was a major watershed. Those who were in favor of a stronger national government won overwhelmingly, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced and brought into being the New Deal. Now, all of this doesn't occur overnight. There was intense governmental activity on a national level. It was the response to the Depression that required tremendous national authority. New agencies were created, new programs were initiated. When the Supreme Court, which was largely full of very conservative judges, began to strike down various proposals and various laws of the New Deal, Roosevelt proposed what was known as the court-packing response, which would have Congress create new judgeships. Well, fascinatingly enough, one of the justices, this was a series of 5-4 decisions that struck down national laws, one of the justices, Justice Roberts, yes, we've had 2 Justice Roberts on the Supreme Court, current one is Chief Justice, switched his vote and began to uphold various New Deal programs, and one wag has said that that was the switch in time that saved 9. Now, from the 1940s through about the 1970s and 80s, there evolved the concept of layer cake or marble cake federalism. Layer cake federalism was really a reenactment or reestablishment of the dual federalism concept, but after the New Deal, the marble cake metaphor came into existence. The powers would be shared by the national and state government. Now, some of the forces that led to the nationalization were, first off, the growth of an interstate economy, professional bureaucracies that wanted to apply their professional knowledge across state lines, and the fact that social issues like transportation, education, income and employment security, and health issues began to be national issues. There was also a growth of federalism in which the federal government made grants to lower levels of government for the support of functions of government which were mutually beneficial to both levels. Let's talk about some of those. One of them goes way back to 1862, the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which helped establish both the University of Texas and Texas A&M University. During the New Deal, there were numbers of these grants to states. Now, most of these grants were in the nature of categorical grants in which the Congress appropriated the money for a very specific purpose. In the 1960s, there were grants to local units of government for things to help alleviate the war on poverty. Categorical grants are made for specific purposes, and when the states take them, called conditions of aid, they have to establish an agency to handle the funds, have to submit an approved plan for action, have to match it either with money or with other kinds of support, and they have to be auditable by the national government for what they've done. Examples of different types of categorical grants are project grants. Texas A&M University Galveston was established as a part of a project grant. They only wanted to establish several Sea Grant colleges, and states bid for having the Sea Grant College. Now, there was already one on the East Coast and already one on the West Coast, but there weren't any in the Gulf Coast. And so two were established, one for the Eastern Gulf, one for the Western Gulf, and Texas A&M University won the grant for the Western Gulf. Or formula grants, in which the money is automatically awarded on the basis of formulas, using things like population, income, etc. The National Highway Act, National Highway Fund, is a good example of that. Now, in the Reagan era, there came about what were called block grants. These were chunks of money given to the states with relatively few conditions. States can decide how they're going to be used for health, education, criminal justice, community development, social services. Increasingly, though, however, block grants are coming under large scrutiny. One of the Republican proposals is to do away with the Affordable Health Care Act and simply give money to the states for health. I hate to say it, but I don't think that dog's going to hunt. So where does the money go? Well, health is 44% of federal grants. Education at 15. Education is at 15%. Transportation 11. The second biggest category is income security, unemployment compensation. Everything else amounts to 4% of 8%. So we keep talking about and have had this new federalism during the Reagan era of returning power to the states and returning administrative powers to the states. Lots of block grants given to the states. Well, how has that played out? Well, it's been mixed. The Newt Gingrich contract with America was supposed to return the power to the states. There hasn't been too much evidence that that worked well. Now, one of the things that there's real concepts of problems are the unfunded mandates, where national governments direct states and local governments to comply with federal rules and regulations, but there's no money to help pay for them. Here at Galveston College, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, required us to make some rather expensive modifications to the Galveston College building, and there was no money forthcoming to help pay for that. Bush administration, budget shortfalls at the state and national level. States raised taxes, cut services, received money from the federal government. After 9/11, we had the No Child Left Behind Act, the Department of Homeland Security, which essentially preempted much of what states were doing in the area of security. And now we have most recently the Affordable Health Care Act. So, where does the Supreme Court sit on all this? Well, it's been mixed. Supreme Court has been pretty well willing to allow Congress to regulate in many areas, but it's been less enthusiastic in some other areas. And there's a series of cases that I have listed here, which you're welcome to look up. I'm not going to ask you to memorize them or to put them on the test, just to be very clear about it. One of the concepts, And I just saw an article in the paper this morning that the state of Texas is going to try to rely on the doctrine of sovereign immunity, that the states cannot be sued in federal court, to protect it in the Sandra Bland case. The right of the state to be free from a lawsuit unless it gives permissions to sue. Well, we'll see how that works out. Final thoughts. How successful is federalism? Well, there are advantages. It allows additional points of access, it promotes diversity, it reduces the number of items at the national level that have to be considered by Congress. What are the disadvantages? States don't have equal resources. One of the discussion questions that I gave you an opportunity to look at is, are the states outmoded? Should we do away with them and consolidate them into districts or provinces or whatever you want to call them? The nation of Canada is bigger geographically than the United States, but it has significantly fewer provinces to deal with. Problems don't stay put. Uneducated people move around, sick people move around, pollution moves around. And one of the things we've seen is that states frequently can discriminate against minorities. The majority in a state can decide that it doesn't want to do something. And the big classic case recently is the Supreme Court decision which struck down state laws which prohibited same-sex marriage. Well, is it over? Is this an over and done deal? Absolutely not. Federalism will continue to develop, and we will continue to try to reach accommodations. It's going to be interesting.